The mission at Castle Itter had been a gamble from the moment Captain Lee was forced to leave his reinforcements behind at the unreliable wooden bridge. Now, with his only tank destroyed and Major Gangel dead, the exhausted alliance of Americans and Germans was down to their last magazines. As the SS brought up heavy guns for the final breakthrough, Lee faced a decision: whether to approve the French tennis star's desperate dash through enemy lines. It was a choice between certain death and a single slim hope of survival. I've been carrying this story with me, and now I'm passing it to you. The emotions are real, the moments are powerful. Links in the description below. Subscribe, make yourself comfortable, and let's experience this together. The Alps stood silent in the first week of May, 1945. From the ramparts of Schloss Itter, perched 2,000 feet above the Brixental Valley in the North Tyrol, a man could see the war ending in the distance. Smoke rising from abandoned Wehrmacht positions, the occasional rumble of American artillery echoing through the mountain passes like distant thunder. But distance, Major Joseph Gangel knew, meant nothing when fanatics still prowled the forests. Inside the castle's courtyard, beneath the shadow of neo-Gothic towers that had watched over this valley since the 10th century, 14 men who had once shaped France's destiny now waited to discover if they would live to see their country free. Former Prime Minister Edouard Daladier stood by the 13th century fountain, hands clasped behind his back, in that pose he'd held through 1,000 cabinet meetings. Paul Reynaud, his successor and rival, paced the opposite wall, 67 years old and restless as a caged wolf. Between them hung the weight of old arguments, old betrayals, the kind that turned allies into enemies even as a greater enemy gathered strength outside. General Maxime Weygand had positioned himself near the gatehouse, his military bearings still evident despite 2 years of captivity. Beside him, General Maurice Gamelin studied the approaches to the castle with the careful attention of a man who had once commanded France's armies and lost. They did not speak to each other. Their mutual silence carried the weight of 1940 and the fall of France. Jean Barotra, the tennis champion who had once leapt across the courts of Wimbledon and Roland Garros, now measured the courtyard's dimensions with an athlete's eye for distance and angle. Marie-Agnès Caillot, the world knew her by her maiden name, de Gaulle, watched him with amusement. Her brother Charles was somewhere in Paris, preparing to govern a liberated France, while she remained here, trapped in this mountain fortress that had been her prison for 2 years. The transformation of Itter Castle into a prison had been completed on the 25th of April, 1943, under the administration of Dachau concentration camp. SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl had seized it on Heinrich Himmler's orders, turning a medieval fortress into a gilded cage for France's most valuable prisoners. They had lived in former hotel rooms, exercised in this courtyard, read from the castle's considerable library. The regime had been, as Daladier once remarked, a mixture of brute force, courtesy, and occasional attempts at friendship. But courtesy ended when the Reich began to collapse. 2 days earlier, on the 2nd of May, Eduard Weiter, the last commandant of Dachau, had died at the castle under circumstances that no one spoke of openly. The prison's administrator, Sebastian Wimmer, had fled the following day, fear written plain across his face as he abandoned his post. The SS Totenkopfverbände guards had scattered like autumn leaves soon after. Now the French prisoners held the castle, armed with whatever weapons the guards had left behind. Rifles that felt strange in the hands of politicians and generals who had not carried weapons in years. Zvonimir Chuchkovich, the Yugoslav communist who had worked as the castle's handyman and electrician, had vanished on the 3rd of May. He'd left on a bicycle, carrying a letter written in English, riding past German checkpoints toward Innsbruck, 40 miles distant. That had been 2 days ago. No word had returned. On the morning of the 4th, Andreas Krobot, the Czech cook, had followed on his own bicycle, riding 8 miles down the mountain to Vergel with a similar message. The town had been abandoned by Wehrmacht forces, but reoccupied by roaming Waffen-SS troops. The kind who shot at windows displaying white flags or Austrian colors, who executed men on suspicion of desertion. Krobot had not returned either. Now it was the 5th of May, and the castle held its breath. François de la Roque, leader of the Croix de Feu movement and resistance member, stood watch at the North Tower. He had been arrested in 1943 for his activities against the occupation. Now, in a twist he could not have imagined, he scanned the forests for SS troops still loyal to a regime whose Führer had put a bullet in his own head 5 days earlier. History, de la Roque thought, had a cruel sense of irony. Léon Jouot, the trade union leader, checked the ammunition for the 3rd time that morning. 30 rounds for the Mauser, perhaps 50 for the machine gun they'd mounted in the gatehouse. Not enough. Not nearly enough if the SS came in force. The castle's massive walls, its deep, dry moat, its nearly impregnable gatehouse, all the medieval defenses that had protected lords and ladies for 7 centuries, meant little against modern weapons. The 88mm guns the SS had been moving through the valley could reduce stone to rubble. The Panzerfausts their infantry carried could blast through walls 3 feet thick. Daladier moved away from the fountain, approaching Renault for the first time in months. Their political differences had once seemed insurmountable. The arguments over appeasement, over the conduct of the war, over who bore responsibility for France's fall. Now those arguments felt like relics from another age. If they come, Daladier said quietly, they will come today. Renault nodded. Before the Americans can reach us. If the Americans are coming at all. They stood together in silence, 2 old enemies united by a common threat, waiting to see which would arrive first, salvation or slaughter. Around them, the castle settled deeper into its waiting. The Alps held their breath. Somewhere in the forests below, the last fanatics of a dying regime prepared their weapons. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. But for the men trapped in Schloss Itter, the most dangerous battle was yet to begin. Lieutenant John C. Lee, Jr. had been sitting in his Sherman tank in Kufstein's town square for 3 hours when the German major arrived under a white flag. 27 years old, stocky, with a cigar clenched between his teeth. Lee watched the Kubelwagen approach with the practiced wariness of a man who had led Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion. Through 5 months of brutal fighting across France and into the heart of the Reich. The war had taught him that nothing was simple, and Germans bearing white flags were no exception. Major Joseph Gangl stepped from the vehicle with the bearing of a professional soldier. 34 years old, Iron Cross First Class pinned to his tunic. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that Lee recognized immediately. This was no desperate deserter or opportunistic coward seeking to save his skin. This was a man who had made a choice. Behind Gangl stood Rupert Hagleitner of the Austrian resistance and Andreas Krobot, the Czech cook who had bicycled down from the castle. The cook's story came out in a rush. French 5 VIP prisoners, abandoned by their guards, armed but outnumbered, waiting for SS troops to finish what Hitler had started. Lee listened, calculating. His 4 M4 Shermans idled in the square, waiting for the 36th Infantry Division to relieve the 12th Armored. His orders were to hold position. But orders, Lee had learned, were written by men who weren't standing in town squares listening to stories about French prime ministers trapped in medieval castles. How many SS? Lee asked. 100, maybe more. Gangel's English carried a thick accent but was clear enough. 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, remnants. Desperate men. Lee knew the division by reputation. Götz von Berlichingen. They had fought savagely in Normandy, executing wounded American paratroopers and French civilians. Now, with their Führer dead and their Reich collapsing, they were the most dangerous kind of enemy. Fanatics with nothing left to lose. "You're asking me to cross into 36th Division territory," Lee said, "to rescue French prisoners from a castle I've never seen, with a force I don't have, against an enemy of unknown strength." He pulled the cigar from his mouth and studied Gangel. "And you're asking me to trust you?" "Yes." Lee grinned. It was the kind of grin that had earned him the nickname Captain Jack among his crew. The kind that appeared before he did something his superiors would call reckless and his men would call typical. "Well, hell. Let's go take a look." The reconnaissance run took them up narrow mountain roads in Gangel's Kubelwagen, Lee, Gangel, and Hagleitner. The castle appeared suddenly as they rounded a curve, perched on its hill like something from a medieval manuscript. 2,000 feet above the valley floor, stone walls rising from living rock, towers silhouetted against the Alps. Lee studied the approaches with a tanker's eye. One road in, no maneuver room. The Sherman would have to sit in the open, exposed. "Suicide," Lee muttered. "Yes," Gangel agreed. "But necessary." They returned to Kufstein as afternoon shadows lengthened. Lee requisitioned 5 additional Shermans and supporting infantry from the newly arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment. Then he gathered his men, 14 American soldiers, including 6 black infantrymen from the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion who had been waiting for transport. He didn't ask for volunteers. He simply told them what needed doing. Sergeant William Rushford, who had been with Lee since France, checked the ammunition load on Besatten Jenny, their M4A3, named by one of the crew for an unfaithful girlfriend. Corporal Edward Shimchick, quiet and precise, test-fired the 75mm gun. The familiar routines of preparation. The bridge 6 miles from the castle changed everything. Lee stopped the convoy, studied the wooden structure, did the mathematics in his head. Too flimsy for the weight of 6 Shermans crossing twice, once there, once back. He sent the reinforcements back, left 1 tank to guard the bridge. Now he had 1 Sherman, 14 Americans, Gangel with his driver, and a truck carrying 10 former German artillerymen who had thrown their lot in with the Austrian resistance. "Still want to do this?" Gangel asked. Lee lit a fresh cigar. "Mister, I came this far. Might as well see it through." 4 miles from the castle, they encountered the roadblock, SS troops with a machine gun nest, preparing to cut the road. The brief firefight shattered the mountain silence. Lee's men moved with the efficiency of veterans, flanking positions, suppressing fire. The SS broke and ran. 1 more obstacle cleared. As darkness fell on the 4th of May, they rolled into the castle courtyard. The French prisoners emerged from the gatehouse, politicians and generals who had shaped a nation's destiny, now reduced to desperate men with rifles they barely knew how to operate. Paul Reynaud, in his memoirs years later, would describe Lee as rough in both appearance and manner. Lee didn't care about manners. He cared about fields of fire. "Where's your heavy weapons?" Lee demanded. "We have 1 machine gun," Daladier replied. "Perhaps 200 rounds." Lee swore creatively. He positioned Besatten Jenny at the main gate, the Sherman's 75mm gun covering the only approach. He placed his men at intervals along the walls, showed the French where to take cover, explained basic fire discipline to men who had spent their lives in parliament halls and military academies, but had not held rifles in combat since the First War, if ever. Then SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Schrader arrived with his family. The French vouched for him, an SS officer who had befriended them during his convalescence, who had chosen humanity over ideology. Lee looked at the man's uniform, the Death's Head insignia, and made another calculation. The war had broken every rule. Why not this one? Night fell over the castle. Gangl used the telephone line to call Alois Meyer in Würgel, requesting reinforcements. 2 more German soldiers arrived, along with a teenage Austrian resistance fighter named Hans Waltel. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, but he handled his rifle like he knew what to do with it. Lee gathered everyone in the courtyard, Americans, Germans, French, Austrians. An alliance that would have been unthinkable a week ago, impossible a month ago. Now it was simply necessary. "They'll probe us tonight," Lee said. "Testing our strength, looking for weak points. Don't waste ammunition. Don't fire unless you have a target. When the main assault comes at dawn, make every round count." Around midnight, the first reconnaissance party appeared in the tree line. Sporadic fire echoed through the valley. The defenders answered carefully, professionally. This wasn't the battle. This was just the prelude. Lee checked his watch. The 142nd knew where they were, more or less. Help would come. The question was whether it would come in time. Beside him, Gangl stood watching the darkness. The German major had defied orders, abandoned his post, thrown away everything a professional soldier spent his life building: career, honor, pension. For what? To protect former enemies from his own countrymen. Why? Lee asked quietly. Gangl was silent for a long moment. Because some things matter more than orders. Dawn would bring the answer to whether they had been right. The first shells arrived with the dawn, screaming out of the tree line at 4 in the morning. Anti-aircraft rounds, 88mm high explosive, slammed into the castle's medieval stonework with enough force to shake mortar from the walls. Lee felt the impact through his boots, felt the castle shudder like a living thing wounded. So much for probing attacks. From his position in the gatehouse, he could see muzzle flashes in the forest, half a mile distant. 150 Waffen-SS, maybe more, under the command of Oberführer Georg Bochmann. They had moved into position during the night, bringing their 88 with them. The same gun that had destroyed 1,000 Shermans across Europe now turned its attention to Schloss Itter. "Contact front." Sergeant Rushford's voice cut through the thunder. "Infantry in the open, 200 yards. Lee swung his field glasses toward the approach. Gray-clad figures moving through the pre-dawn murk, using the terrain, advancing by sections. Professional movement. These weren't the desperate stragglers he'd expected. These were combat veterans executing a coordinated assault. Besotten Jenny spoke first. The Sherman's 50 caliber machine gun opened up, tracers arcing across the valley like deadly fireflies. Corporal Shimchik worked the gun with methodical precision, walking the fire across the German positions. Lee watched 3 SS troopers go down, watched the others dive for cover. Then the 88 fired again. The shell hit 20 yards from the Sherman, spraying shrapnel against the tank's armor with a sound like hail on a tin roof. Inside the turret, Private McHaley would be checking for penetration, counting his blessings. The M4's armor was good against small arms, adequate against most anti-tank guns. Against an 88 at medium range, it was tissue paper. "Shimchik!" Lee shouted. "Suppress that gun position." The 75mm main gun traversed left. Shimchik took his time, adjusted for range and windage, fired. The high explosive round detonated in the trees where Lee had seen the muzzle flash. He couldn't tell if they'd hit anything, but the 88 went silent for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was better than nothing. Along the walls, the defenders opened fire. Gangel's men, Wehrmacht veterans who had fought from Kiev to the Ardennes, worked their rifles with the economy of experienced soldiers. The Americans laid down suppressing fire with their M1 Garands, 8 rounds rapid before the distinctive ping of an empty clip. And the French, God help him, the French politicians were actually fighting. Paul Reynaud manned a machine gun in an exposed position on the north wall, 67 years old and handling the weapon like he'd been born to it. Jean Barotra moved between positions, carrying ammunition, his athlete's body serving him well. Even Daladier, who had appeased Hitler at Munich, now fired methodically at the men who had once been his attempt at peace. The SS pressed their attack. They came in rushes, using the scattered boulders for cover, working closer. A Panzerfaust team made it to within 100 yards of the gate before Gangel's Mauser cut them down. The German major fired from a window embrasure, working the bolt-action rifle with practiced speed. 3 shots, 3 hits. Lee filed that away. Gangel wasn't just a staff officer. He'd been in the mud. At 0530, the castle's telephone rang. Lee grabbed it, heard static and distance and Alois Meyer's voice from Virgil, asking for a situation report. "We're in it," Lee said flatly. "Tell the 142nd we need help now, not later." He hung up as another 88 shell impacted. This one hit the north tower, and Lee watched medieval masonry explode outward in a cloud of dust and stone fragments. A chunk of wall the size of a footlocker crashed into the courtyard 10 feet from where Schroeder's wife stood. The SS officer's family had taken shelter in the gatehouse, but his wife had emerged to help with the wounded. Now she went down, hit by debris, blood streaming from a gash across her forehead. Schroeder reached her in 3 strides, pulled her back under cover, an SS officer protecting civilians from SS shells. The irony would have been funny if Lee had time to appreciate it. He didn't, because now the 88 had found its range. The first shell to hit Besaten, Jenny struck the turret at an angle, deflected upward, screaming off into the morning sky. The second shell didn't deflect. It punched through the Sherman's frontal armor like an ice pick through cardboard, detonated inside the fighting compartment with a blast that blew the hatches open and sent black smoke boiling into the dawn. Lee's heart stopped. His crew, Shimchik, Rushford, McHaley. Then he saw Private McHaley emerge from the driver's hatch, covered in soot but moving. The kid had been alone in the tank, trying to fix the faulty radio. Everyone else had been outside when the shell hit. 1 man, 1 survivor, pure luck. But now they had no tank. The SS must have seen the Sherman die, must have known what it meant. Their fire intensified. Machine gun rounds chewed at the stone walls, sparking off the ancient rock. Rifle fire cracked from a dozen positions. The Panzerfaust team Lee had thought dead must have had friends, because now 2 more teams were visible, working their way forward with the 1-shot anti-tank weapons held ready. "Fall back from the walls," Lee ordered. "Tighten the perimeter." His men withdrew in good order, pulling back to the inner courtyard where the stone was thicker and the angles more defensible. The French followed, Weygand and Gamelin, moving with the stiff dignity of old generals who remembered the trenches of the First War. De la Roque covered their withdrawal, firing until his rifle ran dry, then falling back while Jouhot provided covering fire. The SS owned the outer approaches now. Lee could hear them calling to each other in German, coordinating their assault. Gangel translated the key phrases. "Prepare to breach. Bring up the Panzerfaust. On my signal." They were running out of time. At 0615, Gangel made his mistake. Paul Reynaud had moved to a window embrasure, trying to get a better angle on an SS machine gun nest. The position was exposed, visible from the tree line. Gangl saw the danger, saw the SS rifleman drawing a bead on the former French Prime Minister. The German major moved without thinking, crossed the open space in 3 strides, grabbed Reynaud's shoulder to pull him back. The Mauser round caught Gangl in the chest, 7.92 millimeter, standard Wehrmacht issue. The irony of that would haunt Lee later. A German officer killed by a German rifle defending a French politician from German soldiers. But now, there was only the sound of Gangl hitting the stone floor, the spreading pool of blood, Reynaud's shocked face as he knelt beside the dying man. Lee reached them in seconds. One look told him everything he needed to know. Sucking chest wound, blood frothing at Gangl's lips. The major had maybe minutes. "Hold them," Gangl whispered in English. His hand found Reynaud's arm, gripped it. "Worth it. This. Worth it." Then his eyes fixed on something Lee couldn't see. And Major Joseph Gangl, Iron Cross First Class, veteran of Kiev and the Ardennes, died protecting the enemy he had once sworn to fight. Lee had no time to process it. No time for anything except survival. He pulled Reynaud back from the window, checked his ammunition. 3 magazines left for the M1. Maybe 100 rounds total for the machine gun. The Germans had sustained fire superiority, the 88 Panzerfausts, and time. The telephone was dead, cut by shell fire. The radio in Besaten Jenny was scrap metal. They were alone in a medieval fortress, with ammunition running low and the SS preparing their final assault. Through the smoke and chaos, Lee saw the Panzerfaust team moving into position at the gate. Saw the SS infantry gathering for the rush. Heard the 88 being repositioned for a direct shot at the gatehouse. They had held for 2 hours. Maybe they had 2 hours left. Maybe less. Lee checked his watch. 0630. Where the hell was the 142nd? The SS attack horn sounded, a long, harsh note that echoed off the mountains. Then they came, a wave of field gray uniforms surging toward the shattered gate. And there was no more time for thinking, only for fighting, only for making each round count, only for holding 1 more minute, and then another, until help arrived, or the ammunition ran out, or the castle fell. The Battle of Castle Itter had truly begun. By 0700, Lee had pulled his men back to the inner keep. The outer courtyard belonged to the SS now, and holding it would cost lives they couldn't afford to lose. 4 defenders were wounded, 2 of Gangl's Germans hit by shrapnel, 1 American with a through and through in the shoulder, and Schroeder's wife, still conscious but pale from blood loss. 1 dead. Gangl's body lay in the gatehouse where he had fallen, covered with someone's jacket. There had been no time for anything more. The ammunition situation was critical. Lee did the mathematics in his head as he moved between positions. 60 rounds left for the .30 caliber machine gun. Maybe 20 magazines total for the M1 Garands. The French had burned through most of their rifle ammunition during the initial assault. Wehrmacht's Mauser was down to 5 rounds. Gamelin had switched to a captured German MP-40 submachine gun, but had only 2 magazines remaining. They were running dry, and the SS knew it. The enemy had changed tactics after the first rush failed. No more mass assaults. Now they worked methodically, using the 88 to reduce the castle's defenses piece by piece. Lee watched from a second-floor window as another shell slammed into the north wall, blowing out a section of medieval stonework that had stood for 700 years. Each impact sent tremors through the foundation. Each impact brought the walls closer to collapse. The Panzerfaust teams were closer now, working through the rubble in the outer courtyard. Lee could see 3 teams positioned behind cover, waiting for the signal to fire. One direct hit from those shaped charge warheads would blow the gatehouse door to splinters. After that, it would be close quarters fighting in the corridors and rooms, and the SS had the numbers. "Lieutenant." Sergeant Rushford's voice was quiet. "We got maybe an hour of ammunition left. After that, it's bayonets and hard language." Lee nodded. He'd come to the same conclusion. The question was whether the 142nd would arrive in that hour, or whether they'd find nothing but bodies when they finally showed up. At 07:15, the telephone rang again. Lee grabbed it, heard Alois Meyer's voice through heavy static. The resistance leader was shouting over the sound of gunfire in the background. The SS were moving on Virgil too, trying to eliminate the Austrian resistance before they could send help. The relief force from the 142nd was delayed. How long? Meyer didn't know. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. They didn't have 2 hours. Lee hung up and studied the tactical situation with the cold clarity that came when there were no good options left. The gatehouse was the key terrain. Lose that, and the SS could pour into the castle. But holding it meant exposing his men to direct fire from the 88. And that gun would eventually punch through the stone walls or bury the defenders under collapsed masonry. He was considering a fighting withdrawal to the upper floors when Jean Borotra appeared at his elbow. The tennis champion was filthy, his expensive suit torn and blood-stained, but his eyes were clear. "Lieutenant, I can get out. Over the wall, through their positions. I can reach the Americans, bring them back." Lee studied the man. 56 years old, former Wimbledon champion, Vichy collaborator turned prisoner turned defender. The kind of complicated history that peacetime would spend years untangling. But this wasn't peacetime. "Their riflemen have the approaches covered," Lee said. "You'd be running a gauntlet." "I've run gauntlets before." Borotra's smile was thin. "Different sort, but the principle is the same. You move fast enough, they can't hit you." Lee looked at the man's lean build. The athlete's frame that age hadn't completely softened. Looked at his own dwindling ammunition supply. Looked at the SS positions tightening around the castle like a noose. "If you're going, go now," Lee said, "before they bring up more men." Borotra nodded, requested an American uniform to avoid being shot as an escaping prisoner, and was gone before Lee could reconsider. From the window, Lee watched the Frenchman vault the wall with an athlete's grace, hit the ground running, sprint toward the tree line where the SS riflemen waited. Shots cracked out. Lee counted 4, 5, 6 reports. Saw Borotra dodge left, right, using terrain like he'd used the tennis court, always moving, never predictable. Then the man was into the trees and gone, and Lee didn't know if he'd made it or taken a round in the back. Now there was nothing to do but hold. At 0800, the SS launched their second major assault. They came with covering fire from every position. Machine guns, rifles, the 88 firing directly at the gatehouse at point-blank range. The shell penetrated the outer wall, detonated inside the gatehouse corridor, and Lee felt the blast wave even from the second floor. When the smoke cleared, the entire front section of the gatehouse had collapsed inward, stone and timber blocking the passage. But the rubble created a new defensive position, and Private McHaley, still covered in soot from Basat and Jenny's destruction, climbed into it with the machine gun and started firing. The kid had seen his tank die around him and hadn't broken. Now he worked the .30 caliber like he was born to it. Short, controlled bursts that made the SS infantry dive for cover. Lee moved to support him, firing his M1 at targets of opportunity. Saw an SS trooper with a Panzerfaust 50 yards out, squeezed the trigger twice, watched the man drop. The weapon clattered to the stones unused. Beside him, Paul Reynaud had returned to his exposed position. The old politician's face was set in lines of grim determination, and he fired his rifle with mechanical precision. He had knelt beside Gangl as the German major died, had heard the man's last words. Now he fought with the fury of someone who understood what had been given for his life. The French had stopped being prisoners hours ago. Now they were soldiers, defending their ground with whatever they had. Daladier worked a rifle from a second-floor window. Wehrmacht directed fire from his position like he was commanding armies again. Gemelin had taken over a corner position with the MP-40, his old general's eyes reading the battlefield like he'd read maps in the war rooms of Paris. Even Marie-Agnès Caillot, de Gaulle's sister, proper Parisian lady, was carrying ammunition and helping tend the wounded, moving through the chaos with the kind of courage her brother had shown when he'd refused to surrender in 1940. But courage didn't stop bullets, and bullets were what the SS had in abundance. At 08:30, one of Gangl's Germans took a round through the throat. Lee watched the man die choking on his own blood, watched his comrade try uselessly to staunch the bleeding. 2 dead now. The wounded count was up to 6. The ammunition was nearly gone. McHaley's machine gun ran dry at 08:45. The kid looked at Lee with questioning eyes, and Lee shook his head. No more belts. The .30 caliber was done. Now they had rifles, and whatever rounds remained in individual magazines. Lee counted his own ammunition. 1 magazine in the rifle, 1 in his belt. 16 rounds total. When those were gone, he had his sidearm, a .45 automatic with 2 magazines. 21 rounds between him and hand-to-hand combat. The SS must have sensed the change in defensive fire, must have realized the machine gun was silent. Their attack intensified. Lee saw Panzerfaust teams moving up, saw infantry preparing to rush the gatehouse, saw the 88 being repositioned for a final shot that would bring down what remained of the entrance. At 0900, Kurt Siegfried Schrader appeared at Lee's position. The SS officer's uniform was torn, his face blackened with powder smoke. But he carried a rifle and moved with purpose. An active member of the Waffen-SS fighting on the Allied side. The only time in the war it had happened, and Lee didn't have the luxury of appreciating the historical significance. "They're massing for a final push," Schrader said in accented English. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Lee nodded. He could see it too. The SS had pulled back their forward elements, were concentrating their force for one overwhelming assault. When it came, they would overrun the position through sheer weight of numbers. "Can we hold?" Schrader asked. Lee looked at his ammunition supply, his wounded, his exhausted men. Looked at the French politicians who had become soldiers. Looked at the rubble-choked gatehouse and the SS positions, and the morning sun climbing over the Alps. "No," he said honestly. "Not without help." Schrader absorbed that, nodded slowly. "Then we make them pay for every foot." It was the soldiers' answer, the only answer left when the ammunition was gone and the enemy was at the gates. Lee respected it, even as he hated the necessity of it. He checked his watch. 09:15. Baratra had been gone over an hour. Either he'd made it to the 142nd, or he was dead in the forest. Either the relief force was coming, or it wasn't. Either way, the defenders of Schloss Itter were down to minutes. The SS attack horn sounded again, that long, harsh note that meant the final assault was beginning. Lee raised his rifle, sighted on the first gray-clad figure to emerge from cover, and prepared to make his last 16 rounds count. The Panzerfaust team was 30 yards from the gatehouse when the first American shells arrived. Lee heard them before he saw the effect. The distinctive cracked thump of 75mm guns firing in sequence, multiple weapons, and then the forest erupted. Trees exploded into splinters. The SS positions disappeared in columns of smoke and dirt. The Panzerfaust team simply ceased to exist, vaporized by a direct hit that left nothing but a crater and scattered equipment. The 142nd Infantry Regiment had arrived. Lee saw them through the smoke. Shermans rolling up the approach road, infantry moving in their wake. The overwhelming firepower of a fresh American regiment smashing into the exhausted SS remnants. The relief force had brought tanks, brought men, brought enough ammunition to wage a proper battle instead of a desperate last stand. The SS attack broke immediately. Lee watched gray-clad figures streaming back toward the tree line, abandoning their positions, their wounded, their dead. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Others simply ran, disappearing into the forest with American infantry in pursuit. The Panzerfaust teams that had been maneuvering for killing shots on the gatehouse scattered like leaves before a storm. The 88 got off one final round. A parting shot that screamed over the castle and detonated somewhere in the valley beyond. Then Lee heard the distinctive sound of American tank guns finding their target, saw the forest erupt where the German anti-tank gun had been emplaced. When the smoke cleared, the 88 was silent. It was over. Lee lowered his rifle, felt his hands shaking with adrenaline crash, forced them steady through pure will. Around him, the defenders were emerging from their positions, moving with the careful uncertainty of men who couldn't quite believe they'd survived. Private McHaley sat beside his silent machine gun, face blank with exhaustion. Sergeant Rushford leaned against a wall, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. The French stood in a small cluster near what remained of the gatehouse. Reynaud's face was gray, aged 10 years and 5 hours. Daladier had set down his rifle like it was something contaminated. Weygand and Gamelin stood side by side. Two old generals who had watched their nation fall, and now had lived to see themselves freed by the army of a country they'd once viewed with patrician condescension. Jean Baratra appeared at the head of the relief column, still wearing his borrowed American uniform, looking like he'd just finished a particularly brutal tennis match. The athlete had vaulted a castle wall, run through SS fire, reached the 142nd, and led them back. Now he climbed the rubble-strewn approach with a half-smile on his face, as if leading American infantry to rescue French 5-Ps from Waffen-SS troops was just another day's work. He was recognized by René Lévesque, a French-Canadian reporter embedded with the regiment. The journalist stared at Baratra like he'd seen a ghost, then started scribbling notes furiously. Later, as Premier of Quebec, Lévesque would tell this story countless times. But now he just documented, his reporter's instincts capturing history as it happened. The American commander, a captain whose name Lee didn't catch in the chaos, surveyed the damage with professional eyes. "Hell of a fight," he said simply. "Yeah." Lee found his voice rough, throat raw from shouting orders and breathing cordite smoke. Hell of a fight. By 1000 hours, the mopping up was complete. The SS had lost approximately 100 men killed, wounded, or captured. The prisoners, about 100 in total, were herded into the castle courtyard under guard. Shocked faces revealing men who had believed in their Führer's promised Alpine redoubt, and found instead American tanks and overwhelming firepower. Lee watched them with the detachment of extreme fatigue. These were the same men who had executed American paratroopers in Normandy, who had murdered French civilians, who had spent 5 hours trying to kill him and everyone under his protection. But now, they were just defeated soldiers, young men with hollow eyes who had followed their leaders into oblivion. The medics arrived with the relief force, started working on the wounded. Schroeder's wife was evacuated first, her head wound cleaned and bandaged. The German soldiers who had fought alongside Americans were treated with the same care as Lee's men. One medic started to work on the dead German soldier from Gangel's unit, realized his mistake, moved on. Gangel's body still lay in the gatehouse, covered with that borrowed jacket. Lee pulled it back, looked at the German major's face. Death had smoothed away the tension, left only the features of a professional soldier who had made his choice and paid for it. 34 years old, wife and 2 children in Germany. Iron Cross First Class earned in battles against the very allies he'd died defending. Paul Reynaud appeared at Lee's shoulder, looked down at the man who had saved his life at the cost of his own. He called it worth it, Reynaud said quietly. At the end, he said this was worth it. Lee nodded, pulled the jacket back over Gangel's face. What did you say about a German major who had turned against his own army, joined the Austrian resistance, died protecting a French politician from German soldiers? The history books would struggle with that one. Lee didn't have answers. He just had the memory of a man who had made a choice when choices mattered. The evacuation began at 1400 hours. The French 5URPs were loaded into American trucks and half-tracks, given blankets and coffee and the kind of careful courtesy reserved for important prisoners who had become important allies. Daladier, Reynaud, Weygand, Gamelin, men who had shaped France's policy, who bore responsibility for Munich and the fall of France and everything that followed, now sat in the backs of American vehicles, heading toward freedom and whatever judgment history would render. Marie-Agnès Caillot, General de Gaulle's sister, climbed into a truck with quiet dignity, her expensive dress ruined, her hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Léon Jouot followed, the trade union leader who had fought beside generals and SS officers in defense of a medieval fortress. François de la Roque, right-wing firebrand and resistance fighter, sat beside his former political enemies without apparent irony. Jean Borotra was the last to board, pausing to shake Lee's hand. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for coming when you didn't have to." Lee shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Seemed like the thing to do. The convoy rolled out at 1500 hours, heading west toward France. They would reach Paris on the 10th of May, 3 days before Germany's official surrender. But for the prisoners of Schloss Itter, the war had ended today, on the 5th of May, in a medieval castle defended by the strangest alliance the war had produced. Lee watched them go, then turned back to his own men. They had work to do. Secure the area, process prisoners, document the battle for the after-action report that some desk officer would file and probably never read. The kind of routine tasks that followed every engagement, turning chaos into bureaucracy. But first, he walked back to the gatehouse, back to where Gangel lay. The Austrian resistance would claim the body later, bury him with honors in Virgil, name a street after him. For now, Lee just stood there, paying silent respect to a man who had chosen humanity over ideology and paid the ultimate price. The Alps stood silent around the castle, indifferent to the small drama that had played out on this mountain. In a week, the war would be officially over. In a month, this battle would be reduced to footnotes and anecdotes. In a year, most people would have forgotten it entirely. But Lee would remember the German major who died protecting his former enemy, would remember the French politicians who fought beside their captors, would remember the SS officer who chose conscience over creed, would remember that on the 5th of May, 1945, the old rules had broken completely, and for a few hours, the only thing that mattered was defending what was right against what was wrong. The strangest battle of the war was over. The accounting would take decades. 3 days after the battle, Lee stood in the courtyard of Schloss Itter and tried to make sense of what they'd done. The castle bore the scars of combat. Shell craters in the medieval walls, rubble from collapsed stonework, burn marks where besotten Jenny had died. The maintenance crews had already removed the tank's hulk, towed it away for salvage. Now only an oil stain marked where the Sherman had stood. The official accounting was complete. 1 defender killed in action, Major Josef Gangl, Wehrmacht, Iron Cross First Class. 4 wounded, 2 German soldiers, 1 American private, 1 civilian. Enemy casualties, estimated 100 killed, wounded, or captured. Mission status, successful. All VIP prisoners evacuated safely to Allied control. The numbers didn't capture it. Couldn't capture it. Lee had written the after-action report in the flat. Clinical language the Army required. Had documented the tactical situation, the defensive dispositions, the arrival of relief forces. Had reduced 5 hours of chaos and terror to a series of timestamps and grid coordinates. The report would work its way up the chain of command, be filed somewhere, maybe earn him a decoration. It wouldn't explain anything that mattered. Sergeant Rushford found him in the courtyard, offered a cigarette. They smoked in silence, watching Austrian civilians pick through the rubble. The castle's owner would return eventually, survey the damage, begin repairs. In 50 years, maybe the walls would be whole again. Maybe tourists would visit, admire the medieval architecture, never know what had happened here. Captain's bars came through, Rushford said finally. And the Distinguished Service Cross. They're shipping it up from division. Lee nodded. He'd been a lieutenant when he volunteered for this mission. Now he was a captain, with America's second highest decoration for valor. The promotion wouldn't bring back Gangl, wouldn't change the fact that he'd gone into this undermanned and under-equipped, relying on luck and audacity to pull it off. Think they'll remember? Rushford asked. After the war, I mean. Think anyone will care about a castle in Austria? No, Lee said honestly. They'll remember the big battles, the beachheads and the river crossings. Not this. And yet, this mattered. Had to matter. Because here, in this medieval fortress, the war's clearest lines had blurred completely. American and German soldiers fighting side by side, an SS officer choosing humanity over ideology, French politicians becoming soldiers. Everything the war had been, the clear divisions between ally and enemy, right and wrong, had broken down into something more complicated, more human. The Austrian resistance had buried Gangl 2 days earlier, in the military cemetery at Vergel. Lee had attended, along with the surviving German soldiers from Gangl's unit. They'd stood at attention while the major was lowered into the ground. No flags, no honors from the army he'd technically deserted, just the quiet respect of men who understood what he'd given. Later, they would name a street after him, would erect a memorial describing his heroism. But the official records would remain ambiguous about a Wehrmacht officer who had died fighting his own countrymen. Germany would take decades to reconcile with men like Gangl, soldiers who had served and then turned against the regime when conscience demanded it. Kurt Siegfried Schrader had been arrested the day after the battle. American military police had taken him into custody, his SS uniform sufficient evidence for charges. He'd gone quietly, had kissed his wife goodbye with the resignation of a man who knew what was coming. 2 years in a military prison, his sentence later reduced in recognition of his actions at Itter. He would die in 1995, an old man carrying the complicated history of choices made in impossible circumstances. The French had reached Paris on the 10th of May. Lee had heard reports, Reynaud and Daladier returning to a city that didn't quite know what to make of them. Generals whose strategies had failed defending a republic that had already moved beyond them. They would write memoirs, justify their decisions, argue about who bore responsibility for France's fall. But they would never forget the German major who died to save them, or the American lieutenant who had volunteered for a mission with no good tactical justification. Jean Barotra would return to tennis eventually, would play exhibitions, teach young athletes, carry the memory of vaulting a castle wall under enemy fire. When reporters asked about the war, he would tell this story, and they would think he was exaggerating. No one vaulted castle walls anymore. No one ran through SS fire to save French politicians. These things didn't happen outside adventure novels. But they had happened. Lee had the scars to prove it. Private McHaley appeared at the courtyard entrance, still looking shell-shocked. The kid had survived Basat and Jenny's destruction by pure chance, had manned a machine gun in the rubble until the ammunition ran dry, had done everything asked of him without breaking. Now he stood at loose ends, a tanker without a tank. "We're pulling out tomorrow," McHaley said, "moving west to process prisoners. Captain wants us ready to roll at 0600. Lee nodded. The war was entering its final days. Germany would surrender unconditionally in 3 days, on the 8th of May. The European theater would be finished, and soldiers like Lee would start the long process of going home or shipping out to the Pacific. Schloss Itter would become a footnote, if that. He took one last walk through the castle before darkness fell. Moved through the corridors where French VIPs had been imprisoned, past the gatehouse where Gangle had fallen, up to the ramparts where Reynaud had manned his machine gun. The setting sun painted the Alps gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent. The mountains didn't care about the small human drama that had played out here. In the keep, he found evidence of the prisoner's occupation, books scattered on tables, personal belongings left behind in the rush to evacuate. A chess set, pieces frozen mid-game, someone's reading glasses, the mundane detritus of lives interrupted by war and then freed by it. Lee picked up one of the books, a volume of French poetry, its spine cracked from use. Daladier's, maybe, or Reynaud's. Some politician who had negotiated with Hitler, who had tried to preserve peace through appeasement, now knew what it meant to fight for survival in a medieval fortress. History would judge them harshly for Munich, for the failure to stop fascism when it might have been stopped. But they had fought here. That counted for something. He set the book down, walked back to the courtyard. Rushford had started a small fire, was heating coffee in a battered pot. The surviving defenders, American and German both, sat around it in exhausted silence. Tomorrow they would separate, sort themselves back into proper categories of victor and vanquished. Tonight they were just soldiers who had held a castle against impossible odds. Lee accepted a cup of coffee, sat on the rubble, watched the stars emerge over the Alps. In 28 years, he would die in Norwich, New York, a decorated veteran with stories no one quite believed. The Distinguished Service Cross would sit in a box somewhere, proof of a mission that defied easy explanation. But the memory would remain vivid. The sound of 88mm shells hitting medieval stone, the sight of Jean Barotra vaulting a wall, the weight of Gangle's final words. Worth it? Was it worth it? Lee turned the question over in his mind. 1 German major dead, 4 wounded, a castle damaged, 14 French VIPs freed who would spend the rest of their lives arguing about who bore responsibility for France's collapse. Against that, the knowledge that when it mattered, when ideology demanded one thing and humanity demanded another, some men chose right. History would call it the strangest battle of the war, would puzzle over the alliance of Americans, Germans, and an SS officer defending French prisoners from Waffen SS fanatics. Would reduce it to an anecdote, a curiosity, one of those peculiar footnotes that emerged from the chaos of war's ending. But for Lee, standing in the ruins of Schloss Itter, with his coffee going cold and the alpine night settling around him. It was something simpler and more profound. It was proof that even in the worst war humanity had ever fought, even in the last desperate hours when madness still held the field, some men could look past uniforms and flags and ideology to see what mattered. The castle would endure. The mountains would endure. And somewhere in the official records, filed away and mostly forgotten, the story would endure too. Of one strange day when the old rules broke completely, and enemies became brothers in defense of what was right. Lee finished his coffee, stood, prepared for tomorrow's movement. The war was almost over. The accounting had just begun,